We are getting started. Okay, so we're starting with the Ramban, a very important moment in his life, the Disputation in Barcelona. And this is the first disputation. Well, I should take that back. It's certainly the first disputation of this sort in Spain, but not the first disputation. And it's really a very important moment. It is also a rare moment, as we'll talk about a little bit later. It is a moment, if you will, of victory, but only temporary. And it sets the stage for other similar events that are much more ominous and much more destructive for the Jewish community. Okay, my sources. Rabbi Shmuel Irons has a fantastic lecture on this subject online that I took a lot from. And Chevelle is the classic. He produces the Mossad Rav Kook Ramban, and he also has a book, Ramban Life and Teachings. And Moshe Gil, his article I paste in the middle of this, you'll see that. And Fritz Be'er, or Isaac Be'er, the History of the Jews of Christian Spain, a real classic, also had a lot of great information on this scenario. Okay, so let's start with the following question. Why challenge the Ramban to a disputation? What's happening right now in the world that brings this about? So the disputation happens itself in the year 1263, and we need to peel back a little bit before that. In the year 711, the Muslims take over Spain. Spain's very disorganized. Christians don't have a lot of strength, and they're really feuding with each other, and the Muslims have a very easy time of taking over Spain. The Christians had treated the Jews very poorly, and the Jews were more than happy to join the Muslims at that time, and they take over most of Spain. In 803, France, which is a sort of a backwater place, it doesn't have merchants, it doesn't have a lot of commerce, is a country that is taken over. Charlemagne manages to conquer into Spain. He starts to encroach on he starts what I guess you would call the Reconquista, the reconquest of Spain, and he manages to capture Barcelona. And Barcelona gives him not just real estate, it also gives him access to the Jews, and the Jews are great merchants at this time. And the Jews themselves are a merchant class, and we'll see that there are a number of very interesting things that the Jews will offer. But there is very good evidence on this. There was a Persian scholar. He sort of was like the postmaster general of the Persians, and he tells us about the Radhanite merchants from the land of Radhan of the Jews, and he'll describe for us. I'll present the text here for you in a minute, but this is the map of where the Jewish trade routes went to, and you can see that they go over here from the Frankish Empire all the way out to China, and they will go north. They will go to the land of the Khazars. They will go through Arabia, and Jews are excellent at this. You'll see that on this map, all these dots on the map are places where there are significant Jewish communities. And the advantage of this is, if you are a traveling merchant, you can, let's say, collect your wares from the Far East. You might travel over land to let's say Turkey, and then you'd get on a boat, and that boat would take you. Let's say you sailed from there to Tunisia and Morocco. So when you got to Tunisia, and you need to have a kosher meal, is there someone there for you? Of course, there's someone there for you. Do you have a language in common with them? Yeah, they probably have somebody there who speaks Hebrew. You can speak Hebrew, right? Who else can do that? If you're a Frankish knight, your ability to speak to people in Tunisia or Algeria might be a little bit challenged. Hold on a second.
Like that?
So you might be a little bit challenged in those ways. Also, fascinatingly, and this is worth a discussion all its own, that because all of these people are subject to Talmudic law, you have this built-in, this baked-in legal system, which is sort of like an international system of international law where Jews can rely on each other, right? They know that that one guy follows Talmudic law. You can take him to a court. You can more or less know that you have a fair legal system. You could take a person to the Beis Din of Istanbul. What is very interesting, by the way, is that this system breaks down today, because someone could call me up and say, they have called me up. They say, I have a complaint about another Jew, and I would like to, I'd like to open up a din Torah against him. I can't do anything. I can't coerce anybody to go to court. But back in those days, communities could actually do that. And what also is interesting is that the waters were controlled by the Muslims, and they weren't having any Christian ships. And France and Europe were controlled by the Christians, and they weren't having any Muslim merchants. But who could play both sides of the fence? The Jews. This is again from Moshe Gil's article. Moshe Gil tells us where these Rodanites, these Rodonite merchants traded with. You can see Arabian Peninsula, North Africa, Egypt, Palestine, Syria, northern parts of India, and Khorasan, right? They even reached Constantinople, Antioch, Slavic islands beyond Byzantium. They were Caspian Sea, right? They were, they went all over the place, and they were polyglots, and they spoke many different languages. And the person who again wrote about them is this Ibn Cordabe. He was the postmaster general of the Persians, and so he came to understand this network very well, and he writes about them. It is also interesting what kinds of goods they carried, right? They carried slaves, male and female, juvenile, brocade furs and swords. China, they carried musk, aromatic wood, camphor, and cinnamon. Now, I put this up here because I think, this is something which happens a lot, and the accusation of Jews in the slave trade. There were Jews who were merchants, and one of the things that was bought and sold back then, unfortunately, were slaves. Jews were probably more like the truckers in the industry, and not the people who were actually catching slaves. But this is an unfortunate and ugly part of the world back then. So the Jews, though, were particularly important to Spanish Jewry because they represented sort of the lifeblood of commerce, right? If you had made metalwork in Spain and you wanted to sell it in Salonika or in Tunisia, well, you needed a Jewish merchant to take your wares and to travel with them and to sell them in a distant location. But then, in the year, you'll see the important year here for us is about 1250, and these represent the various stages of the Christian Reconquest of Spain. And the green area here is conquered in 1250. And so that means that except for this small portion of Spain, which is called Granada, Spain is almost entirely Christian now. And the Jews, as a result, become less powerful because now there's this real sense of this real strong crusader sense of having conquered Spain. The wars are largely over, and now you have your soldiers, have now taken their guns and turned them into coffee pots, as this little cartoon is suggesting. And after the war, see, Jews no longer needed to provision armies, and Jews competed with returning soldiers, and economically, they weren't seen as the great lifeblood, but a little bit more as the competition. And so their social standing is particularly weakened as of this time period, 1250. Now, remember, this great dispute takes place in 1263. So we're really on the heels of this particular moment. And so, given that we're on the heels of this particular moment, let's also do a quick review of some of the religious history of the time. Pope Gregory Gregory the Ninth, apologies there. Gregory the Ninth established the Papal Inquisition to regularize the prosecution of heresy. This prosecution of heresy is something which already started to deal with the Jews. We dealt with it in our last session when we talked about the burning of the books of the Talmud and the burning of the books of Maimonides in 1233 and 1243, those two events. But here, the primary job of the Inquisition wasn't really against the Jews, it was against the Cathar heresy. Cathar heresy was a very sort of interesting kind of heresy. It was a heresy where they believed that there was sort of a dualism to the world. There's a good God, and there is a sort of a devilish God, an evil God, and the evil God is all the things material. And every human person is really a materialized angel. And there's some people who are called the perfect, and the perfect, they've managed to divorce themselves from anything material, and they live a life of great simplicity, and they're not interested in wealth. And one of the things that they feel is that the Catholic religion is wrong, because if everything material is part of the devil's world, there's no way that the Christian God could have made himself material, because that would have been something that God would never do. So you have sort of this heresy against the Catholic Church. And by the way, two things that were forbidden by the Cathars were procreation and meat. You couldn't eat meat because possibly that was your grandmother who turned into a cow. That was part of the transmigration of souls. And procreation is, why would you want to bring more fleshiness into the world? To combat this heresy, famous priest Dominic of Osama was sent to reform and repent the Khazars. And here he goes and he realizes that he has to be more pure than they are. And he's going to fight real false purity or false piety with real piety. He's going to fight purity with purity. He's going to fight asceticism with asceticism. And he's going to he has to set up an order of monks that are going to follow him in this way. And he starts these debates with the Albigensians. The Albigensians that's the region where this group of Cathars were very prominent. And in this region, there becomes this great war that takes place between the church and these followers of the Gatha religion, also known as the Albigensians. Incidentally, the debates actually didn't work. They didn't help convince anyone. On the right, by the way, you have this scene where supposedly Saint Dominic puts a Bible and a Cathar holy book into the fire, and the Cathar book burns up, but the Bible is untouched. So this is widely considered apocryphal, that it didn't happen, but nevertheless, this is part of what is believed, because part of the reason it's people think that it didn't happen is because if it did happen, probably would have convinced a lot more Cathars than he actually did. And the Christians mount a real crusade against the Cathars. Béziers and Carcassonne are two places where they are particularly where the crusade is particularly bloody. We have a letter from Arnaud Amalric, who is an abbot who played an important role in the Albigensian crusade. And when he brings the knights into Béziers to rid it of the Cathars, the knights ask, well, how do we know the difference between Catholics and Cathars? And he says, kill them all, for God knows which are his own. And he writes a letter to the Pope saying that he killed 20,000 people in that city. So 20,000 people is probably more people than died in the cities of Mainz, Speyer, and Worms when the Crusaders went there to do this. What the Crusaders are interested in is they're interested in liberating any land on this earth from infidels, and the Cathars are convenient infidels. In the city of Carcassonne, they expelled them naked from the city, and so you see this particularly brutal enterprise. What happens is that rather than having to rely on the royalty, because the royalty itself was sometimes uninterested in doing this. In fact, when you look at the history of the Albigensian Crusade, part of the reason it becomes so difficult is because the nobility doesn't really want to participate in this until they're absolutely forced to. And so the church sets up its own body of inquiry and policing of religious purity, which is called the Inquisition. Another thing to just be aware of that really changes at this time is from the time of St. Augustine, there was something called the Doctrine of Witness. And the Doctrine of Witness was when the idea that Jews were the protectors of the Old Testament, and that the Christians were not meant to convert or to persecute the Jews because they needed them around to verify and validify the Old Testament, which the Christians obviously read in Christological terms, right? They read those in terms which support their religion, and so you need to be able to verify the document. In the year 1240, right, slightly before this Reconquista makes its way almost to Granada, what you discover is that both Jews and Christians are forced to listen to missionary sermons. In other words, they come into shul, and the monk, the friar, maybe a priest, a bishop, gives a whole missionary sermon that you have to listen to. And this was a relentless enterprise that went on for centuries. And at this point now, though, the Doctrine of Witness sort of fades to the background, and the Inquisition, which is really sort of a crusader kind of concept that Christianity is going to conquer the world, and now we have the right to find out who's really pure, right? And this is Bernard of Guy, right? You have this very powerful institution, and this powerful institution, Bernard of Guy, we actually have some interesting Jewish references from Bernard of Guy. Bernard of Guy tells us that there was this Jewish practice of erasing the baptism, right? So they would put baptismal waters on the forehead, and Jews had this practice of rubbing out the skin by the forehead and then going into the mikveh to undo the baptism, because that was part of the process of teshuvah. And that's actually written in the annals of Bernard of Guy, And you may find similar references in the Shach and the Taz in some of their discussion about conversion and repentance and returning to the Jewish community. It's really a fascinating subject. But these friars, who now that they have gotten rid of all of the cathars, are prepared to bring the truth of Christianity everywhere. And they begin to learn Hebrew, and they begin to start to read Jewish texts. Now, originally, the church wasn't interested in the books of Torah Shebaal Peh, Talmud, Mishnah, Midrash, because those books represented the group of people who were at war with the early church fathers, right? And so if the Pharisees and the Chachamim were the enemies of the early Christians, who wanted to read what they had to write? So the early church wasn't interested in those documents. But by the time we get to the 13th century, by the time we have an Inquisition, by the time friars are starting to read Hebrew, all of a sudden they're interested in these Jewish documents. Now, James I of Aragon is the first. He allows these, like as I mentioned, he allows the friars to go in and give these sermons to the Jews. In 1243, he releases a decree. Whenever the bishop, or the Dominicans, the Franciscans, want to come in, the Jews will plentifully listen. Interestingly, in the year 1263, the same year as the Disputation, they relax it a little bit, and they say that you can only take in 10 monks. Apparently, they would go in and give this sermon, and there were lots of, there's a mob of angry Christians, right? Because you can imagine, going in, I don't know, Parshat Va'era, right? And the story of the Akedah, and the friars getting up there and talking about how Yitzchak took the wood up the mountain, and he's telling you that that's really the cross, and they're interpreting everything Christian with Christian eyes and lens, and now you have to adopt that, and you're walking out with three big Christian bullies who are telling you, well, what kind of wood was Yitzchak carrying up that mountain? So, what are you supposed to answer? Now, the friars started turning from accusing the Talmud of heresy to using it as a tool to convert the Jews. If you recall, the burning of the Talmud was because a Jew by the name of Nicholas Donan, who is an apostate, he was kicked out of the yeshiva of Rabbi Yechiel of Paris, and he goes to essentially to the Pope and to King Louis of France, and he says the Jews no longer they're no longer acting as witnesses, right? They're no longer living letters of the law. What are they doing? They study this other book besides the Bible, and you know what it's called? It's called the Talmud. And he accuses the Talmud of essentially creating a heresy, even according to the definition of what Jews are supposed to be, and that's what leads to the burning of the Talmud. But now, rather than using the Talmud as a cudgel to beat the Jews over the head, because saying that you Jews are not being good Jews, now they're using the Talmud and saying, you know what? The Talmud really also thinks that Jesus is the Son of God. The Talmud also thinks that Jesus is the Messiah. And that is where the disputation gets off the ground in Barcelona. You have this convergence of a couple of different things going on all at the same time. The first thing is that the relative position of the Jews seems less integral, less important, because now that they have all of Spain, they don't seem to want to rely on the Jewish merchants quite in the same way. That's number one. Number two is you have this institution called the Inquisition, which is already starting to need to find a new, how should I put it, a new raison d'etre, a new type of heresy to war against. And so they're teaching their friars Hebrew, and it's particularly valuable to them, by the way, when they get a convert. Now the converts are often used because they have much more intimate knowledge of Jewish texts than others. And Pablo Christiani, the disputant here, is himself a convert. But I have to pause to tell you one of my favorite Jewish Christian debate jokes. And a little bit of this joke I think is a little bit funny because it plays on the fact that Jews and Christians really speak different languages, which is certainly part of what's challenging in these debates. And so, for example, the joke goes as follows. So the rabbi and the Pope are sitting down to a debate, and the rabbi does not speak Latin, and the Pope does not speak Yiddish. So what are they supposed to do? So here's how the debate goes. The Pope goes like this, and the rabbi goes like this. The Pope goes like this. The rabbi goes like this. And then the Pope takes out the wafer and the wine. The rabbi takes out an apple. And the Pope gives up. So the cardinals go to the Pope and says, I don't understand, what happened? So the Pope says as follows. He says, first, I held up my finger and said that first I held up 3 fingers to represent the Trinity. And he responded by holding up 1 finger to say, God is one. I think I got these out of order. He says, then I waved my finger around him so that God was all around us. And he said, no, God is here on the ground here with us. Then I pulled out the wine and the wafer to show that God absolves us of all our sins. And he pulled out an apple. He reminded me of original sin. What can I do? The rabbi had an answer for everything. So the rabbis Talmudim go to him and say, Rabbi, what happened? He said, look, first he said, he holds up 3 fingers. He says, I give you 3 days. I said to him, we're not going anywhere. we're not leaving. And then he says, and he says, the whole country is ours. And I said, we're not going anywhere. We're staying right here. And then the Talmudim say to the rabbi, well, what happened? He says, I don't know. We broke for lunch. He took out his lunch. I took out mine. Anyway, hopefully you find that joke as funny as I think it is. But this is the story of Jewish debates. Now, before we get into debates, you have to understand the way that the debate was set out is inherently unfair, because the terms of the debate start like this. The Ramban is told that the question on the table is, does the Midrash say that Jesus is the Messiah? Now, let's just say the answer to that turns out to be in the negative. No, the Midrash does not say that. There's no necessity in Christian theology for the Midrash to have said that at all, right? That's not a promise that the Christian church had made. So they're not really risking anything on their side. But if they can prove that the Midrash says that Jesus is the Messiah, wow, then the Jews are really going to have to believe. So the Ramban starts with telling us of the debate rules. And there are 2 existing accounts of this. There is a Latin version and there is a Hebrew version. The Ramban wrote the Hebrew version. And the Ramban, by the way, was not expelled from Spain immediately, as some would suggest, because we know that the Ramban had to listen to one of these sermons the Shabbos after the debate. And we know he was in Barcelona the Shabbat following the debate. So one of the rules, by the way, he says, is I want it to be clear that the king is not involved. I'm not arguing with you, the king. I'm just arguing with this Pablo Christiani. And he says, our Lord the King commanded me to discuss with Friar Paul, that's Pablo Christiani, in his and his counselor's presence in his royal palace in Barcelona. I replied saying, I shall do according to the command of my Lord the King only, if you will permit me to speak freely, and for this I desire the permission of the King and the leave of Friar Raymond de Pennefort. Raymond de Pennefort is the head, I believe he is the head of the Dominican order and the head of the Inquisition in Barcelona. So he says, I want permission. I need freedom of speech. If you don't give me that, then I can't participate in this particular debate with you. He says, so I need to be able to be free to speak my mind. And they told him he's free to speak his mind. So one of the first proofs that Pablo Christiani comes out with, and he says, even Maimonides says that the Messiah is going to die. So Ramban pulls a fast one. And he says, well, I can't work without my tools. I need, let's bring in a copy of the Rambam. And I want you to show me where in the Rambam it says the Messiah is going to die. So the Ramban leads him and they says, oh, bring in a book of Shoftim. In the book of Shoftim, in the book of Judges, right in the end of Hilchot Sanhedrin, that's where the Rambam discusses Mashiach, right? And there is where he's supposed to say that the Messiah could die. Now, the Ramban knew that this was actually written by the Rambam in the Igeret Hashmad, in the letter on apostasy or persecution. But he knew that this guy, Friar Paul, wasn't really learned. He just, he's one of these guys who picked things up like by what people schmooze about in yeshiva. And so because he wasn't very learned, he walked right into the trap. And he essentially impeached his accuser right there at the beginning of the dispute, because he lays out, the guy is telling you that this is written in the Rambam, that the Messiah will die, and it turns out that it's really in the Igeret Hashmad. But you should just know, when he says that the Messiah could die, he said because Maimonides' Messiah is not this magical creature that changes the whole world. He's a king. He's a king that's going to unite the Jewish people. There's not going to be magic. There's not going to be anything of remarkable nature. The king is someone who will unite the Jewish people and inaugurate an era of peace and of knowledge of God, and the anti-Semites will go away, and all will be good for the Jews. And then the Mashiach can die, because he starts as a man, he ends as a man, lives his life as a man, dies as a man, all good. And so the Ramban knows what Maimonides has written, and he knows that Friar Paul does not know that, and he lets Friar Paul walk right into the trap. And he essentially impeaches his accuser. Okay. Now, here he is telling you the argument. This is a very powerful argument. The powerful argument that the premise of Friar Paul is that the Jews should accept Jesus as the Messiah because the Midrash proves it. And he says, wait a minute, I don't get it. He says, I retorted before we debate on this point. I wish that he would teach me and inform me how it is possible to prove from his assertion from the Talmud. I've heard that while Friar Paul traveled in Provence and many other places, he made similar statement to many Jews, at which I am very much amazed. He should tell me now whether he intends to state that the sages of the Talmud believed that the Nazarene was the Messiah, and they further believed that he was both an actual mortal man and a true deity, which is the opinion of the Christians. Indeed, it is not known that the affair of the Nazarene took place in the era of the Second Temple, and he was born and killed before the destruction of the temple. The sages of the Talmud, such as Rabbi Akiva and his colleague, lived after the destruction, and those who taught the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi and Rabbi Natan, lived many years after the destruction. Rav Ashi, who completed and edited the Talmud, certainly lived about 400 years after the destruction. If these sages believed in the uniqueness of the Nazarene, meaning Jesus, And if they believed that he is true and his belief and faith are true, then if they wrote those things from which Friar Paul says that he will prove his claim, how could they have remained in the Jewish religion and in their former way of life? They were Jews. They remained in the Jewish religion all their lives. In other words, if what you're saying is true, that all these rabbis really believed that Jesus was the Messiah and he was the Son of God, and that the whole, Gansa Maisa, and the wafer and the wine and he released everyone from Jewish law, then there's a lot of effort that goes into the Talmud, right? They put a lot of effort into making Jews Jews. Why not just give the whole thing up if that's what they really believed? In other words, the entire enterprise of writing the Talmud and writing the Midrash and preserving the Jewish people says all over it, we reject that whole principle. And it's not like you can say, oh yeah, it was really embedded and they really meant it because Jesus lived after. No, if you know your history, Jesus lived first and then came the Midrash. So therefore, the Nachmanides says that in principle, there's no way that it could be true. Additionally, he has a very interesting perspective. Just if you understand Midrash, Ramban says that Midrash itself is not compelling. It offers an opinion, but it is not authoritative. So when you read, for example, this week's parsha, Habor Reg Ve'ein Bo Mayim, the pit was empty and it had no water in it, and it says that no water means that there were snakes and scorpions in it. So you're not compelled to believe as a matter of faith that that's exactly the kind of pit that Joseph was in. It's an interpretation, but it's not compelling. You're not bound to it. And the Ramban says that in his Disputation. Another proof about original sin is they want to prove that Jesus has released everyone from original sin. Now, Ramban, you can see he's very witty, very pithy. He says, in our country, they say, he who wishes to tell a lie has his witnesses live far away. Yeah, sure, I have two witnesses to this transaction. They happen to live on the far edge of Greenland, and they're not coming back for 4 years. Yes, I have witnesses. They live in Antarctica. So he says, look, the curse of Adam and Eve is, cursed is the ground, thorns and thistles it shall bring forth. By the sweat of your brow, you're going to work the land. He says, all of these things are still doing today. I don't know how you guys eat, but I eat because they plowed the ground by the sweat of their brow. That's how they get the wheat. And you can see all of these are happening. You want to tell us that Jesus released you from Gehenna? Great, right? In our country, they say he wishes to tell a lie has his witnesses live far away, right? Because Gehenna, which is not among the punishments enumerated there in Scripture, is forgiven. You make this assertion because there is no one to contradict you. Send one of you, let him come and tell us whether Gehenna still exists or not, right? So again, he's very pithy on this. He argues that God cannot make himself into flesh and blood and turn himself into the hands of his enemies. But perhaps more compelling than this is he says, look, the idea of Mashiach means that you're a king, and king means that you have dominion. And so the idea of having dominion, of having control, means that you have political power. He said, I answered, no, I believe and know rather that he has not come, meaning Messiah has not come. Besides the Nazarene, there has never been a person in the world who himself said of whom it was said that he is Messiah. It is impossible for me to accept that he is the Messiah. For the prophet has said of the Messiah, he will have dominion from sea to sea and from river to the ends of the earth. The Nazarene had no dominion. During his life, he was persecuted by his enemies and was hiding from them. In the end, he fell into their hands and was not even able to help himself. The Ramban said he wasn't even king over himself. So if he says he wasn't even king over himself, he was king over nothing, right? the Mashiach needs to be king over something, and this man was not even the political king over himself. He'll also make the argument that the if he was supposed to bring dominion over the world, well, guess what? And you say that because the Roman Empire took on Christianity, that shows his dominion. Well, the Roman Empire had its authority and its breadth well before Jesus ever came onto the scene. And guess what? It was after they took on Christianity that they started to shrink. So he says that doesn't make any sense. Doesn't make sense. You can't call Jesus the cause of their dominion. He also says the Messiah is supposed to bring peace to the world. What kind of peace do you see? So the Ramban is both learned, he is sharp, he speaks freely. Famously, James the First of Aragon, at the end of this, at least in the Ramban's account, he says, I don't understand how someone who is so wrong could sound so right. And the Ramban publishes his account of this disputation. The Ramban's account reveals the fact that at this point the church really doesn't have full power, and they do still they cannot fully exercise their authority over the Jews. And in addition, it doesn't appear that at this stage lots of Jews defected or converted because of this disputation. That will not be true throughout. There is another disputation that takes place a couple hundred years later in Tortosa, and the outcome of that is catastrophic. Many Jews give up at that point and convert to Catholicism, and there are many secret Jews at that point in Spain, and there are many secret Jews who convert because of this relentless pressure of hearing these sermons week in and week out, and again these major public disputations. But at this point, the Ramban succeeds in his disputation. But because he publishes his results, he becomes persona non grata, and he ultimately is then forced out of Spain, goes into France for a short period of time. He writes his commentary on the Bible, and then he ultimately makes his way to the land of Israel. But perhaps the important thing to see here is this is one of those scenarios where the Christians are starting to learn how to debate these things with Jews, and they debated these kinds of things in the way that we debate the efficacy of vaccines and immigration policy. These are the hot topics of their day, and the Ramban is one of the great defenders of the Jewish people. And he, by the way, anybody know Ramban's in the Latin version? He's not known as Moshe. His Spanish name was Bonstroca de Porta. So that was that's how he was known to the Christians. But his disputation to this day remains a classic of Jewish literature, and perhaps one of the sharpest retorts against Christianity's insistence that Jews adopt their faith. Okay, so that was quite a mouthful. Know if anyone had questions, comments, thoughts. I have a feeling Sam's got something. All right. Well, I guess I left him speechless today. Sam?
I enjoyed every moment.
Okay.
Rabbi, I have a question. It's Lynn.
Hi, Lynn.
Hi. Are there sort of written records of all of this?
Yeah, there's a Latin version, and there's and the Ramban has his records it in his book. I actually left my copy of this in the shul office. But this book, this volume, there's an English version of it, but the Hebrew one that I have was annotated by Chevelle, by Chaim Dov Chevelle, writes this in the Kitvei Ramban, published by Moselle Rav Kook.
Thanks, Rema. It's very interesting.
Yes, Ramban, you're right. Marcus says that Ramban lives in Girona. Yes, and his cousin, by the way, is Rabbeinu Yonah of the same city. Ultimately, Rabbeinu Yonah goes into southern France, and as Sam likes to point out to me, it wasn't really France back then. It was known as Narbonne, Languedoc, Pasquère, Provence, had different names, different rulers. They weren't all,
and they weren't speaking French.
And they didn't speak French.
There's a slow transition, but at that time they were speaking Occitan and other things.
Yeah. So, well, as my father used to say, my son is illiterate in multiple languages. So that would, yeah. But you know, that showed you, by the way, but that proves, though, is that's why the Jews were valuable. Is because, yeah, sure, they couldn't communicate with, they didn't speak Occitan necessarily. Rabbeinu Tam didn't speak Occitan, and you know, and Rashba didn't speak French, but they all spoke Hebrew.
Valuable.
They all spoke Hebrew.
Valuable.
And as Yeshayahu Gavni said, if you wanted to write a letter to a Jew who's going to live 1,000 years from now, you should write it in Hebrew, because that's the language they're most likely to understand. Jews have always used and understood Hebrew.
And they were, you know, that the opening battle for when the Albigensian Crusade, the first thing that one of the vassals of the Count of Toulouse, the big cheese, had Raymond Troncabel, who lived in Carcassonne. The first thing he did is he got all the Jews out of Béziers to avoid the armies from the north. They were just too valuable to fall into the hands of the Crusaders coming from the north. They took them all to Carcassonne. They made business go. They could read. They had, as you pointed out, confrères all around the Mediterranean basin. They were just too valuable.
Yeah, there's a amazing article. I was thinking of. Let me see. This article I found. Moshe Gill quotes the article. It's by Goitan. Moshe Gill is a scholar of the Cairo Geniza, and he writes this evaluation of this Jewish trade network, and he demonstrates how there's a lot of good scholarship that supports their existence. And he quotes this article by Goitan. Goitan is a great scholar of Jewish history, of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Cairo Geniza, and in Goitan's article, he talks about this whole class of rabbinic trade scholars. And I'm sort of thinking that maybe it's a great Hanukkah lecture. Maybe next week I will do a special Hanukkah lecture on this subject, because I think that it's very interesting to see this blend of Jewish businessman who is also a scholar, and that part of that story is the spread of the Talmud. So
where would you do that lecture?
A Zoom channel near you.
You're talking about this particular Wednesday night affair?
Yeah, it could be Wednesday night. We'll see what exact time would be the best for that, but probably something like that. So anyway, everyone have a great night. Thank you for joining.